After we've established now that if a person leaves the table without benching, that they have to return back to their table and bench there, we move on to Sa'if base. And in this discussion number 2 on the subject, we're going to take a look at the heter, or the leniency of the smak, and how the poskim rely on it. The Tur quotes the Sefer HaMitzvah's cotton, the smak, that if one did leave the table and one forgot to bench, but one has bread in one's possession, then one can eat the bread in the second location, and then one can bench in that location after eating the bread. The bread that he is eating in the second location, it ends the meal that he began at the table, and there's no need to return back to the table. The Mechaber also paskins like the smak, and he also writes that in Sa'if base, that if one had bread in one's possession, then one can just eat that bread wherever one is, and one can bench after that bread, and that will suffice. One does not have to return back to the table, for by eating bread in another location, one becomes obligated to bench in that location. That becomes the end of the place where one ended one's meal, and that is where one's obligated to bench. So this is the leniency of the smak, and it sounds logical that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel only disputed and only dealt with a case of somebody who left the table without benching, where they need to bench from that point onwards. And if it were that they ate in another location and they finished in that location, then everyone would agree that that is the location that one recites Birkas HaMazon. Now, everybody holds of the leniency of the smak, no one argues against it. And the truth is that according to the Ramah, there would be no reason not to rely on the smak. However, according to the Mechaber, there are some difficulties. But before we point out those difficulties, we need to jump to another sugya, which is dealt with mainly in Siman Kuf Ayin Ches, which is the issue of Hesech Hadas, when returning back to the table to continue one's meal. It's not so clear-cut as to whether one can just sit down and eat. It may be that one has to make new brachas before eating. And just to get a rough idea, let us take a look briefly at that sugya in Psochim, and in particular the final opinions of the Mechaber and the Ramah. So we digress now to the Gemara in Psochim, where Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshes dispute what to do when one leaves the table where one was eating, but one returns afterwards to continue one's meal. According to Rav Chisda, if one was eating a bread meal, or dvarim hatu'unim brocha b'mkoiman, which we will call bread for now, if one was eating a meal of bread and one left the table, then one can return back to the table and continue as one left off. There's no need to make any new brachas. However, Rav Sheshes holds that as soon as one leaves the table, one effectively has ended the meal, and when one returns back to the table, one returns to start a new meal. And therefore, before one continues to eat, one would first have to make an after bracha over what one ate before leaving the table, that is bracha lemafreya. So one would first have to bench, and then one would have to wash and make hamoitzi in order to begin a new meal of bread. So Rav Sheshes holds that returning back to the table is not just as straightforward as that. One doesn't just go back to where one left off. One is in fact engaged in a new meal, and one has to bench over the last meal before beginning the new meal, which begins with its own concomitant brachas. Now, there are occasions where Rav Sheshes will hold you don't have to make new brachas, and there are occasions where Rav Chisda holds you do have to make another bracha when you return back to the table, but we will deal with that all in its right time. For now, let us just understand that Rav Sheshes, according to Rav Sheshes, leaving the table and starting a new meal comes with its complexities. Now, in Siman Kufayin Ches, the Ramah lands up paskening like Rav Chisda, that if one is eating a meal of bread and one leaves the table, then one can return back to the table and continue eating as one left off. No need for any more brachas. But according to Rav Sheshes, the Mechaber paskins like the Rambam, who paskins like Rav Sheshes, that as soon as one leaves the table, one has effectively ended the meal, and returning back to the table would require first benching over the meal that one was eating, and then one would have to wash and make hamoitzi in order to begin the next new meal of bread. So that is a general outline of the machloikas, the general issue in Siman Kufayin Ches. Now let's return back to our Siman, and let us understand that Rabbeinu Peretz's Eitzah would only work according to the Ramah. Rabbeinu Peretz advocates that if one leaves the table without benching and one has bread, then one can eat that bread in the new location and one can bench thereafter. And that would be a very smooth leniency according to the Ramah and Rav Chisda, because there is no need to make any new brachas over eating the bread in the new location. There are no complexities. One can just continue one's meal in the second location, and one can bench after that meal, and one can have have benched in the right location, according to Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. However, according to the Mechaber, there are complexities here, because when one got up from the table originally, one has effectively ended that meal. And when one eats bread in a second location, then one is faced with the obligation now to bench before eating that bread, and then wash and make hamoitzi before eating that bread, and then benching again a second time after eating that bread. That would be the correct procedure according to Rav Sheshes. But we're still left with the problem then of how does one land up benching the first time over that bread in the second location when one is in the wrong location to bench? One should be benching at the original spot that one ate. And that is the difficulty that we have with the Mechaber, which we need to resolve. The Prisha, the Drisha, deals with this issue first, and he holds that the Mechaber could only have been dealing with a situation of somebody who left the table without benching, but when he sat down to his meal originally, he had in mind that he would continue to eat this meal in another location. So therefore, when he gets up from the table and he takes his bread to the second location and he eats the bread at that second location, he is in fact continuing his first meal. And even Rosh Hashanah would agree that there's no need to bench or to recite new brachas in the second location. He is justly extending his meal. And that must be what the Mechaber is talking about. And that would circumvent having to return back to his original seat in order to bench there. Now, the difficulty with this understanding is twofold. Firstly, the Mechaber himself says, he introduces Sa'if base by saying, Bamid Dvarim Amurim. This whole discussion that we have between Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, the Rambam, the Rosh, Shogeg, Mazid, having to leave, having to return back to one's seat, only applies to where a person is not going to be eating again. But when he has bread and he is going to be eating again, then when he eats bread in the second location, he can bench there. So clearly the Mechaber is referring to all of the situations mentioned in Sa'if Aleph. He's not specifying here that we should have said Bamid Dvarim Amurim. When does this apply? When he never had in mind to eat in another location. But if he had in mind when he began his first meal, then indeed he wouldn't have to bench. He could bench in the second location. Then that would have been clear. But the Mechaber doesn't say that. He qualifies that everything that we spoke about in the first Sa'if can be circumvented by taking bread to the second location. So even if he doesn't have in mind when he sat down to eat, and even if he got up knowing that he had, thinking that he'd benched, then he would be able to eat bread in the second location and bench over there. So that's the first difficulty, that we cannot give specific parameters to what the Mechaber is dealing with, because the Mechaber has given it as a general rule. All of these issues can be circumvented by the Smak's Eitzah. And the second problem is that when we look into the wording of the Smak himself, in the Hagos HaSmak, the Smak clearly is dealing with a case of someone who did not have in mind at the beginning of the first meal to bench in another location. The Smak is dealing with a situation of someone who got up and benched and ate somewhere else, whether that's considered a break in the meal. And that's a whole discussion in the Hagos HaSmak there. So it's very difficult to read the Drisha's interpretation into the Mechaber. We will come back a little later and we will try and resolve for the Drisha. But for now, let us move on to the second interpretation of the Mechaber, which is the Magen Avraham. So again, the Magen Avraham points out the issue that according to the Mechaber, it wouldn't help to take bread to another location because one would still have to bench before eating that bread. And that would bring us back to the original problem of how can you bench in the second location over a meal that you ate somewhere else. So to that, the Magen Avraham answers as follows. The truth is that the Mechaber is dealing with a case of where one took bread to another location, one benches before eating that bread, one then washes, makes the bracha of hamoitzi before eating his second piece of bread, and then one benches a second time after finishing that bread. And the purpose of the exercise is in order to be yoitzi all of the opinions, as follows. We're dealing with a case of somebody who left the first meal without benching, b'shoigeg. He didn't know that he hadn't benched, or he thought that he did bench. He left the table, and he realized that he hadn't benched yet. Now, according to the Mechaber, this situation is a sofek. The Mechaber, remember, did not reconcile between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. According to the Mechaber, there is a doubt as to what he should do. So if he can return back to the table where he ate, then he should. If not, then if it's impossible for him to return, then he doesn't have to make any effort. He can bench in the second location. But because it's a sofek, according to the Mechaber, then if he benches in the second location, and then he washes, and then he eats more bread, and then he benches again in the second location, then he will be able to fulfill all of the opinions. By benching a second time in his location, he will be able to satisfy the opinion of the Rosh and of Beis Shammai, because now he has eaten, he has finished a meal in a second location, and he is benching in the correct location at this time. At the same time, by benching before eating the bread, he has satisfied the opinion of the Rambam and Rav Sheshes, who holds that you have to bench lamafreya over what you ate already, and then make brachas before you begin your new meal. And the Mechaber is hereby incorporating all of the different opinions over these two different sugyas, that in terms of hesech hadas, in terms of interrupting the first meal, he would bench over that first meal, and because he was b'shoigeg, because he left the table thinking that he already benched, there is a doubt whether he actually has to return back to the table. So by benching in the second location, he can at least it's not the optimum, but at least he can rely on the doubt, on the sofek, to bench in the second location. But as an added measure, then according to the Rosh, he would still be obligated to go back to his original location and bench over there. And according to the Rosh, that's when you can wash over and bench over the bread in the second location. And according to the Rosh, that obligation will be satisfied as well. So the Magen Avraham sees that the Mechaber over here did omit some of the details as to what to do, but we could read that in because we know what the Mechaber already holds from Siman Kufayin Ches, that once you've left the table, it's not enough to just continue your meal. You would have to make some brachos, you would have to satisfy the opinion of Rav Sheshes as well. All right, so where that leaves us at this point in the discussion is as follows. According to the Ramah and according to the Ashkenazi Achronim, we have the Alter Rebbe, the Mishnah Berurah, we would hold like the smak and the leniency of the smak without any strings attached. That if one has bread, then one can eat that bread in the second location without having to make any new brachas, and one will bench after eating that bread in the location that one finished one's meal, now the second location, and that would satisfy the obligation to bench in the place that one finished one's meal. According to the Mechaber and according to Sfardim, there would be more complexities involved. That if one left the table without benching, then if one left the table unknowing, b'shoigeg, then one has leniencies in the fact that maybe one doesn't even have to return to the table. One can bench in the second location, but just to satisfy all of the opinions, one should wash again, one should bench first, recite Birkas Hamazon over what one already ate in the first location. One should wash, one should eat this bread a second time, and one should recite Birkas Hamazon over the bread a second time, and thereby bench in the second location as well. So over the sofek, whether one has to return back to the original spot, one can satisfy that, one can get out of it really by benching here in the second location. But in order to in order to accommodate the Rosh and Beis Shammai as well, one should wash and have a second meal in this location and finish off in this location and bench in this location. So according to the Sfardim, things would be a little more complex. All right, so that is the general outline of the sugya. Those are the different opinions. And now we finish part 1, and we're going to begin part 2, the analysis of these opinions and the Magen Avraham. We begin part 2, the analysis, with a few questions on the smak and on the Magen Avraham. Question number 1. On the smak and on the tur who's relying on the smak, from where do we know that this operation is acceptable, to eat bread in another location and then bench over there? Perhaps Beis Shammai would hold that that's not good enough. Beis Shammai held that one has to bench where one ate, and when one gets up from the table without benching, one has to return back to that location and bench over there. Perhaps Beis Shammai would hold that one is still obligated to go back to the original location and bench where one ate originally, since one got up from the table without benching. It's the act of getting up that requires one to return back to one's seat, according to Beis Shammai. And therefore it would make no difference if one has bread and one can eat in a second location. One got up from the table without benching, and that is what obligates the person to go back to the table and bench over there. So that's the first question. From where do we know that Beis Shammai would agree to this? Question number 2. The mechaber who is in doubt in a case of shoygeg may have what to rely on, that one can eat in the second location and bench in a second location, because having to bench before eating that bread in the second location was itself a doubt. However, what of a case of mazid? When a person leaves the table knowing he hasn't benched, then according to everybody, he is obligated to return back to the table. And he would not be allowed to bench in the second location before eating his bread and going and benching again a second time. So how does the mechaber then allow someone who left b'mezid to use the eitzer of the smak? It wouldn't help. He would have to go back to the table and bench anyway before eating the bread a second time. So we need to understand how the mechaber would accommodate the Rambam, which is his shitta. The Machzis HaShekel also raises this issue on the Magen Avraham. And one cannot say that the mechaber is only dealing with a case of shoygeg, because again, the mechaber began Sa'if base with the words Bameh Dvarim Amurim, that this entire discussion is only when there's no bread to be eaten in the second place. And this entire discussion was referring to mazid as well, leaving the table knowing one hadn't benched. So that's a difficulty with the interpretation of the Magen Avraham, that we're only dealing with a case of shoygeg. That can't be. And now, how would the mechaber hold in a case of mazid? And why does the mechaber still seem to be relying on the smak in a case of mazid, where it's plain and clear that he would be obligated to return back to the table to bench. He could not bench in a second location under any conditions. Question number 3 is also on the Mechaber, because in the case of shoygeg, where a person leaves the table thinking he'd bench and then he realizes he hasn't, the Mechaber did not hold like either Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. He left it up as a safek. And in a situation like this, we already have the parameters from Sa'if Aleph as to what to do. That if he can return back to the table and bench where he ate, then he should. If he cannot return back to the table and ate where he ate, then he can bench in the second location. After all, it is a safek, and even we could venture to say a sfeika d'Rabbanan. So, what would he really be gaining by using the smuk's leniency? Because if anything, he is now putting himself in a position where he has to make extra brachas just to be able to do some semblance of benching where he ate in the second location. And instead of going through that whole rigmarole, why doesn't he just go back to the table where he ate originally and bench over there, and thereby satisfy Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel without having to resort to making more brachas unnecessarily? And if he can't return back to his original location, then he can bench where he is. After all, he is b'shoygeg. So, what is the point, according to the Mechaber, of relying on the smuk? Mima nafshach. Either go back and bench where you ate, or he can bench where he is without having to eat more bread and make more brachas unnecessarily. So the whole point of the exercise needs to be understood. Okay. We will come back to answer these questions and others as well. Let us first begin by reviewing the principles that we came to in Sa'if Aleph in the previous discussion. One has to recite Birkas HaMazon after finishing one's meal at the table, at the place that one began and finished one's meal. According to Beis Shammai, this is part of the mitzvah d'oraisa of benching, and according to Beis Hillel, this is a rabbinic obligation to show deference to the mitzvah before getting up and attending to one's affairs. According to Beis Shammai, the mitzvah of Birkas HaMazon is va'achalta v'savata uverachta. One will eat and one will feel satisfied. And feeling satisfied means that one is, after one's meal, one is aware that one is satisfied, and in one's mind and in one's senses, one senses that one is no longer hungry, and one feels gladdened or relieved or stable or emotionally satisfied as well, that one's hunger is staved. And that feeling of satisfaction, mental satisfaction, results in the obligation to bench, v'verachta. And that mental satisfaction is a feeling that is transitory. It's something that one only feels when one is, just after one has eaten and one has filled oneself. But as soon as one leaves the table, then that feeling dissipates. One's mind is then occupied with other things. and that sort of moment of semi-euphoria has passed. So according to Beis Shammai, the obligation to bench, to recite Birkas Hamazon just after one has finished one's meal, is only doraisa if one has experienced the satisfaction, the mental satisfaction at the table after finishing the meal. But if one gets up from the table and one comes back to the table in order to bench, then after that satisfaction has gone, after that feeling of satisfaction has gone, because one has attended to other affairs and one's mind has been shifted to other, and attention has been shifted to other areas, and then one sits back to bench again, then one is not going to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa anymore. One is no longer in a state of mental satisfaction. One can fulfill the mitzvah of benching at most d'Rabbanan. So according to Beis Shammai, there was a need to implement a gzeira. There was a need for the Chachamim to institute that if one leaves the table without benching, then one has to return, even if one left b'shoyeg, even if one was unintentional, even if one was all in innocence, because the Chachamim wanted to inculcate in the minds of the population that they need to bench at the table before leaving in order to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. So as a safeguard, Beis Shammai instituted a gzeira, a measure, that one has to bench at the table, and if not, one has to return back to the table. Whereas according to Beis Hillel, one can fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa wherever one remembers to bench, as long as one is still physically satisfied, as long as the body does not hunger for more, one is still satisfied, one can bench wherever one is and fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. And therefore Beis Hillel understood that the reason for benching before leaving the table is to give preferential treatment to the mitzvah, that one should recite Birkas Hamazon before going off and attending to one's affairs. Similar to Tzedek Lefanov Yahalech V'Yasem L'Derech Pamav. First you take care of your religious obligations, and then you can go and take care of your personal ones. So therefore, only if a person leaves the table b'mezid, if a person willfully neglects to bench first, then he deserves a penalty. He must return back to the table at his inconvenience and bench. So that's what we described in our first discussion on the subject. And this leads us now to the smuk. When one leaves the table without benching, then according to Beis Shammai, one has neglected the mitzvah d'oraisa, and one will not be able to fulfill that mitzvah anymore, because the feeling of satisfaction has passed. The smuk advises that there is still a way to recapture the mitzvah d'oraisa, and that is to eat more bread in another location. For by eating more bread, one is able to re-experience that feeling of mental satisfaction, and when one feels that again, then one becomes obligated midoraisa to bench, and one can fulfill one's mitzvah that way, so it is not a lost cause. And that is what the smuk is advocating. He is not providing a solution to finishing one's meal, or to extending the meal, but rather the smuk is providing a solution as to how to recapture the mitzvah d'oraisa of Birkas Hamazon after V'Savaita. So after establishing that the smuk, and before I continue, I just need to clarify here that all this time I've been talking about the smuk, but it's not the smuk. It's actually a hagos smuk, which is Rabbeinu Peretz. So for the rest of the shiur, I'm going to switch to Rabbeinu Peretz, which is the smuk. The Rabbeinu Peretz has now provided us a way to be able to recapture the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon Doraisa, according to Beis Shammai, that by eating in a second location, one can now re-experience svia, mental satisfaction, and it's as if it's tantamount to finishing the meal there, and one can now bench v'achalta v'savata uverachta in the place that one has experienced mental satisfaction. And that answers the first question: how did Rabbeinu Peretz know that it would be enough to eat in the second location, and why Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel would not require that they would have to return to the first location all the time? And that is because when one eats in the second location, one is now re-experiencing svia, and there is no difference now between what one accomplished in the first location and in the second one. It's the same thing. Once one experiences mental satisfaction, then one is obligated to bench midaraisa. So therefore, Rabbeinu Peretz has provided a solution to be able to recapture the mitzvah doraisa. We now move to Mechaber and Ramah, but first we will begin with the Ramah, where this explanation of Rabbeinu Peretz would work, and it would be seen in light of the Ramah's opinions as well, as to having to make more brachas before eating. So, according to the Ramah, and those who hold like the Ramah, like Rav Chisda, that when one is eating a bread meal, one does not have to make brachas again when one interrupts the meal, then this way, there would be a way to recapture the sensation of svia by eating bread again in a second location, and thereby enjoying the experience, and then being able to bench midoraisa afterwards. However, according to the Mechaber, who holds like Rav Sheshes, it is difficult to understand the smuk, the Rabbeinu Peretz, in this way, because as soon as one leaves the table, according to the Mechaber and Rav Sheshes, one has effectively lost the mitzvah doraisa of Birkas Hamazon. One will never be able to experience svia again after leaving the table. And because one has interrupted a bread meal and one has to start the meal again now, there is no way to recapture that sensation of svia, and there is no way to return back to the original meal per se. So according to Rav Sheshes, there would be very little value in making another bracha over a piece of bread in another location, because one is not going to recapture the mitzvah doraisa. So therefore, according to the Mechaber, there must be another understanding of Rabbeinu Peretz that he has, because once one has left the table, there is no way to recapture the mitzvah doraisa anymore. Before we come to an understanding of the Mechaber, let's just take a look at the different permutations. According to the Mechaber, what the halacha would look like when we factor in Rav Sheshes as well. When one leaves the table without benching, then there is no way to eat again, because one has interrupted a meal. Hesach hadas, there's been a break in the meal, and according to the Mechaber, if one wants to continue eating, one would have to bench, and one would have to now start the meal again. So if one leaves the table, whether it's b'shogeg, not knowing that he hadn't benched, or even b'mezid, where he knew he hadn't benched yet, and now he's in a second location, then it would serve no purpose to eat bread in that second location, because the opportunity to bench midoraisa has passed, and we have the gzeira of Beis Shammai that he has to return back to the original place where he ate, and the knas of Beis Hillel where he has to return back to the original place where he ate, and that is what he would be obligated to do. Granted, if he was in a position where he couldn't return to the table, so it was a extenuating circumstances, then Beis Shammai would relax the gzeira and Beis Hillel would relax the knas. I'm not going to get into these details. I fleshed them out in the previous shiur. According to Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel would both relax the gzeira and the knas respectively. So what purpose would it serve then to eat bread in the second location when he would have to wash and he would have to bench again? And to this, we can answer the mechaber in two ways. The first is the drisha, and the second way is the Magen Avraham. The first approach is the drisha, that perforce the mechaber must be dealing with a situation of where he sat down originally at the table and he had in mind that he would continue to eat bread even after he got up from the table. And in that situation, even Rav Sheshes would agree that he does not have to bench and then wash again in the second location if one had in mind from the onset that one was going to eat bread in two locations. Then that would spare him that would not be considered a break in the meal. And only then would one be able to still fulfill the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon according to Beis Shammai midoraisa, because one would be able to eat bread in the second location without restrictions and thereby re-experience svia, the mental satisfaction of eating, and then one would be able to bench in the second location. And the phrasing of the mechaber at the beginning of Sa'if base, when he says Bamed Dvarim Amurim, the mechaber must have been referring to his opening statement of the Siman and at the beginning of Sa'if Aleph, where the mechaber introduced the halachas by saying one is obligated to bench where one ate, one is not allowed to leave the table until one has recited Birkas Hamazon. And now, Sa'if base, Bamed Dvarim Amurim, when does this apply? That one is not allowed to leave the table only if one doesn't have bread. But if one takes bread to a second location and one continues his meal there and eats the bread there, then it is permitted, since he had in mind at the onset of the meal that he was going to eat somewhere else, and he has bread to eat and complete his meal somewhere else and re-experience svia, then there would be no issue, even according to Beis Shammai, because one would still be able to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. So that is the approach of the drisha. And the truth is that if one looks into the text of Rabbeinu Peretz and Agos HaSmak, one will notice that the Rabbeinu Peretz is dealing with both issues. He's dealing with having in mind at the beginning of the meal that one's going to eat elsewhere, and the issue of having to return back to the table if one left, shogeg b'mezid. The Rabbeinu Peretz is dealing with both of those issues. And he ameliorates both by saying if one has in mind to eat in another location, then one can eat there and bench there as well. So it's not far-fetched, and it's not far-fetched to say that the mechaber was dealing with this understanding of Rabbeinu Peretz as well. So that accounts for the drisha. The second approach is that of the Magen Avraham. And here, perhaps we can provide a new explanation for Rabbeinu Peretz and how the mechaber understood what Rabbeinu Peretz was coming to resolve. Understandably, when one leaves the table without benching, one will not be able to recapture the mitzvah d'oraisa anymore. That is a given, according to Beis Shammai. According to Beis Hillel, of course, one can bench as long as one feels full. However, there is a second issue, which is the gzeira of Beis Shammai, that he has to return to the table, and the knas of Beis Hillel, that he has to return to the table in order to bench there. And it is that issue of the Rabbanon that Rabbeinu Peretz is coming to resolve. That is to say, that the Rabbanon imposed a gzeira, according to Beis Shammai, that a person needs to return back to the table, even b'shoigeg, and experience inconvenience, so that it would inculcate within him the need to bench at the table before leaving. According to Beis Hillel as well, the Chachamim imposed a knas, that when a person leaves b'mezid, knowing he hasn't benched, then he needs to also undergo some sort of inconvenience by returning to the table, which would serve as a deterrent not to get up from the table in the future without benching. And Rabbeinu Peretz is adding that the same would apply to benching and eating bread and washing in a second location. That if one has to undergo some inconvenience by benching, washing, making hamoitzi, and then benching again a second time, that inconvenience is tantamount to returning back to the table to where he ate originally. And the person would experience he would get the same message from having to go through this rigmarole in a second location that he would having returned to the table. And perhaps this is the way that the Mechaber understands Rabbeinu Peretz. Although it's a bit of a chiddush, nonetheless, Rabbeinu Peretz is holding that if a person has to suffer some inconvenience, then Beis Shammai would be satisfied that they have fulfilled the gzeira, and Beis Hillel would be satisfied that they have suffered an adequate knas. And in this way, we can understand the Mechaber as follows. When a person leaves the table and he's lost the mitzvah d'oraisa, then midrabanan, there are still debts that need to be paid. If he can return to the table and bench, then he should. If he can't return to the table because of extenuating circumstances, then Beis Shammai relax the gzeira, Beis Hillel relax the knas. But if he has bread with him and he doesn't want to return to the table, then he can put himself through another inconvenience, which would also satisfy his rabbinic debts. Now, here, Beis Shammai would not, and Beis Hillel as well, would not require him to return to the table in order to bench, because he's going to put himself through some other exercise in order to satisfy the gzeira and the knas. So according to Rav Sheshes, one would still be able to perform some sort of act of inconvenience in lieu of having to return back to the table. And that is the way that the Mechaber understood the Rabbeinu Peretz, and that is what the Mechaber is relying on. And this is the approach of the Magen Avraham, that the Mechaber understood from Rabbeinu Peretz that there is a use in washing and benching in a second location, namely in order to satisfy the gzeira and the knas respectively. And that would answer what was the use of Rabbeinu Peretz according to the Mechaber, and that would also answer the third question as to how can the Mechaber allow a person to bench in another location if he left the first one b'mezid, when everyone holds that if he leaves b'mezid he would have to return. The answer is that even if a person leaves b'mezid, if he does not want to return back to the original location, as long as he puts himself through some inconvenience, that inconvenience is tantamount to going back to the original location. And now, with that, we can also understand that when the Mechaber begins Sif Beis by saying Bamed Vorim Amurim, that when does this apply? The Mechaber was in fact referring to everything enumerated in Sif Aleph, that all of the issues of Shoigeg Mezid can be ameliorated by having bread to eat in the second location, by having to undergo some inconvenience. He would thus be satisfying the Gzeiras Durabanan. And according to Beis Hillel, he would still fulfill the mitzvah of benching Midoraisa. So the wording of the Mechaber would be taken literally, and Bamed Vor Memurim applied. So in conclusion, Rabbeinu Peretz advocates that if one has bread, one can eat that bread in the second location, and one can thereby and bench in that second location according to everybody. Now, how we understand Rabbeinu Peretz and what the final halacha is subject to a machloikus between the Mechaber and the Ramah. According to the Ramah, Magen Avraham, all the Ashkenazi poskim, the Alter Rebbe, the Mishnah Berurah, according to all of these poskim, one can eat bread in the second location without having to make new brachas. And after eating a small amount of bread, doesn't even need to be a kazais, after eating a small amount of bread, one now re-experiences the sensation of svia, of satisfaction. And now one is able to recapture the mitzvah d'oraisa of benching according to everybody. According to the Mechaber, however, when one leaves the table after not benching, without benching, one has interrupted the meal, and one will never be able to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa according to Beis Shammai. And so, how we understand the Mechaber is subject to a machloikus in the Noisei Kelim, and how various communities, Sephardi communities, would hold. I'm not quite certain, but they would either hold the stricter view of the Drisha or the more lenient view of the Magen Avraham. The stricter view of the Drisha is that if a person has in mind, when they sat down to eat, that they were going to continue eating their bread in another location, then so be it. After they leave the table, they don't have to now. They haven't interrupted their meal, and they can continue and finish that meal in another location, and then they can recite Birkas Hamazon in the second location. But if they did not have in mind before sitting down to eat that they were going to eat elsewhere, then indeed, when they get up from the table, there is no recourse. They have to return back to the table because they have interrupted the meal. There is no way that they can eat bread in a second location. They would have to return back to the table, and they would have to bench over there. And then we would go back to the previous discussion as to extenuating circumstances, shogeg and mezid, and all of the conditions. That is the stricter view of the Drisha. The more lenient view of the Magen Avraham is that, granted, when one gets up from the table, one has now interrupted the meal and one can no longer go back to that meal, and there is definitely no way to recapture the mitzvah d'oraisa of benching. However, in order to satisfy the gzeira of Beis Shammai and the knas of Beis Hillel, one can eat bread in a second location, and one is allowed to bench in that location first, and then wash and then make hamoitzi, eat the bread, and bench a second time. For by undergoing that inconvenience, one has satisfied the gzeira and the knas of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel respectively. Even if one didn't have in mind at the time when one ate originally that one was going to eat elsewhere, it's still fine. One can either choose to go back to the table and eat at the table, or one can eat in the location that one remembers that one hadn't benched, or even bemazed if one had in mind when one left the table to bench elsewhere. One can still bench by undergoing all of these various, by going through the whole rigmarole of having to bench and then wash and then bench again. How Sfardim would hold, I'm not sure. It may depend on various communities. And with that, we conclude the second discussion, Seif base, on Rabbeinu Peretz's option to eat bread in a second location.